Hello everyone, Mike again, and the next in the series of Lightroom basic introductory videos, and this one's moving on in the develop area. As you'll see, I've picked a different image this time because I wanted to talk about the histogram, the tone curve, as well as the basic panel there on the right, and also the magic of the Alt key. Some of you will have heard me say this in the club before. So, the histogram. I mentioned in one of the earlier videos that the histogram on the top right hand corner is the same thing as you'll have on your camera if you have histogram displays on the camera, and it's a representation of how many pixels within the image are dark, mid-tone, light. In this particular image, if you hover over it, you'll see within Lightroom that the section here that's highlighted is blacks. As it goes across, this is the shadows. Then you have exposure, which will affect this. As you move to the right, there's highlights, and then there's the whites, which is the brightest area of the image. If we go and hover over the little up arrow to the right hand side, that's the white areas. A clipping warning where the white has been blown out, and as you might expect, the lamp, as you'll see in the middle as I go on and off that, is showing that it's burnt out. The brightness of that lamp was too much for the camera to record fully in this exposure. And at the left, we've got something stacked to the left. There's not actually anything showing at the moment, but I'll put those two clipping warnings on so we can see what happens. Now, I said to start with, that's showing you where the distribution of pixels in your image are. There's no right or wrong histogram shape. It depends on the look you're looking for. If you want a darkish look, as this is, then having most of the pixels in the darker areas, in the shadows and into the blacks, is what you would expect to see. If you want a higher key image, a brighter image, you would expect to see more on the right hand side of the histogram. If you want an average normal daytime shot, you would see the histogram going up and down with a majority in the midtones. But you can see exactly how this works if you come down and look at the exposure here, and I'll just drag this around, and this is probably a way to experiment with Lightroom. Drag the sliders about, see what they do. Take them to extremes so you can see what an extreme setting will do, and then you know what that slider is doing to your image, and you can tweak it more or less to achieve the effect you want. But the exposure slider is perhaps the main one that will show you the use of the histogram. If I move this exposure slider to the right, watch the histogram as I move it. It's moving along because we're forcing more of the pixels to be in the middle, and they're starting to stack up on the right. You'll see that stacking up on the right hand side as more are getting clipped on the right because I'm overexposing it, and the brightness that was already bright around the light is getting bigger. If I drag this back to the left and start underexposing, you'll see that the blacks will start to turn blue with the clipping warnings, where the darker areas of the image are now blocking out. And as we know, camera club judges don't like a lack of detail in the shadows. So the histogram is an easy way for you to see where your image has detail and where it doesn't. I'm reasonably happy with the exposure of this. I might actually push it up a little bit just to make it fractionally brighter. But this was an LED light, and the colour was a bit weird. It was a greenish colour coming off this bulb in this light. So I'd like to correct the colour balance. And the simplest way to do that is, as we did on the previous, take the eyedropper tool and click on something you know to be a neutral tone, a white or a black or a grey. Well, this was a white wall, so if I click here, I should find that bringing the whites, moving the greens away. And the way for the Lightroom to have done that is to move the tint away from the greens and towards the magentas. I think it's overdone it a little bit for my taste, so I'm going to override what the eyedropper did and bring that back a little bit. I'm going to have to put up with some greens at this stage. The next area that you may want to adjust is the contrast, and bring that down a little bit to, it was already a contrasty image, but I want to flatten it out a little bit so that there's a bit more detail in the shadows. Now, I mentioned the magic of the Alt key. As I come on to these next areas, and it happens in a number of other panels in Lightroom's Develop module as well, I'm going to hold down the Alt key as I drag the sliders, and you'll see what happens. I'll start, because we've got the whites blown out here with this warning, by moving the white slider. This purely affects the white areas. As I hover over the histogram there, there's a section there that goes lighter grey, and the whites slider is highlighted. So if you want to affect that area, you can see that's the slider you need to use. If I hold down the Alt key, the image will go black and white as soon as I start moving the slider. And it will show me very clearly the areas that are overexposed. Now, I don't want to bring that down too much, so I'm going to actually leave that where it is. And I'm going to try and recover some details by pulling the highlight slider down. Again, I'm going to hold down the Alt key, and as I pull that back, it's recovered some detail there. I'm pulling it back just enough to get until that white area just about disappears. No further. There's no need to go any further than that. So now, although it's difficult to see, there's a little more detail here than there was before. The highlight recovery has brought that back. Now, there were some darks when I moved the exposure slider down. Some blacks were black. There's a little bit of detail here. But again, if I hold down the Alt key, and this is for demonstration, not necessarily for great artistic merit, as I pull the black slider down, we're showing which colours are clipping there in the shadows, and now you can see that rubbish bin there is going completely black, and now some of the doors and window frame details are going black. I don't really want to do that much, but to demonstrate what's there, I'll just leave a little bit of black there like that. Obviously there is detail in these shadows, but you can't see it at the moment, and as we know, we want details in the shadows. So again, if I hold down Alt key and then drag the shadow slider up, it will remove some of that, but the shadows is probably best done just looking at it and taking it up until a level. There's some detail here in these shadow areas that wasn't there before. If you ever want to reset a particular slider, hover your mouse over the name and double click and it will automatically go back to 0. So that's where it was. I think I want it about there, just to bring some more detail, but not overdoing it. A lot of these sliders will move one way and the other, and they will affect each other. By moving the shadows up, we've burnt out a few more highlights. I'm not too worried about that. I'll leave that just a little bit down. That's the Alt key. That's the histogram. The other thing we have is the tone curve. The tone curve is very much like the histogram. And as you'll see, this graph here shows the pixels in exactly the same way as the histogram there. Tone curve works very simply. This line is the linear response of the decoder of the raw file, and we can make different areas brighter or darker to change this. I'm happy with where the midpoint is, so I'm going to just click on the midpoint and put a little dot there to stop that midpoint from changing. Now, if we drag up and down the pixels underneath that area will go brighter or darker. So if I want to bring the highlights down, I'll go towards the right hand side where the bright areas are and pull that down, and you can see if you look at the light, which is the brighter area there, I can bring that down a little. The shadows probably a little bit more. I don't want to affect these tones too much, but by putting that center dot in there, it's stopping the whole thing moving. The shadows I probably want to brighten a little bit. That's probably reasonably good. I've got detail all over the image now. If you want to change an individual channel, this is showing RGB. Let's go for the green channel. There's a bit too much green here. I couldn't get rid of it in the white balance and tint. So what I'm going to do is just take the middle of the green and I'm going to darken it down a little. Doesn't need much, just a fraction. And because it's the highlights that probably need darkening more, I'll pull the green highlights down but leave the shadows as they were. So there we are. Quick view of the histogram and the tone curve and the magic Alt key. Remember that Alt key, it's very useful. Thanks for listening, and more detailed stuff to come. Bye.